Hello, everyone. Today we are continuing to talk about ancient Greece. And what I want to do in this little lecture is point to some of the most celebrated legacies of ancient Greece. And I want us to pause a bit on some of the paradoxes of ancient Greece. So I have out here a brief outline on and under legacy and cultural achievements, a number of things. First among them, philosophy, and then under paradoxes, I want to talk about these notions of freedom and slavery, of rationality versus superstition, and the role of women in Greek society. Let's begin with achievements of classical civilization. In the area of governance, we've talked already about the development of the polis, the political philosophies, and the celebration of democratic ideals. And these democratic ideals, I mean, people can have different ideas about how to organize. Some people think that broad participation is a good idea, and other people think that broad participation, for a variety of reasons, is a bad idea, that perhaps broad participation is bad because people are not equal and only the good people should rule. And some people more self-servingly might think broad participation is bad because it might lead to a system of more equality and equal distribution, and that limits the ability of selfish people in power to self-deal. And that's a reason to not want to have democratic and broad participation in government. So there's a variety of reasons for which people might advocate the particular political philosophy that they have. But the United States of America was founded on an idea that broad participatory government is a good thing. And as we formed not a full democracy, but a democratic republic. John Adams, for example, one of our founding fathers, in response to the intolerable acts by England in 1774, he wrote that free men fight better than slaves. And he invoked the history of the Persian wars in which Greece, outnumbered, outgunned, with less experience, nonetheless withstood invasions by the great Persian Empire. And the way in which, one of the reasons that John Adams understood that was for this reason of culture and coming down to a spirit spread individually and over the group perhaps, but that notion that free men fight better than slaves. And this is a reason to have a freer, more society. At any rate, so governance is definitely one of the achievements that we laud ancient Athens for, at least the thinking, the political thinking along those lines. Also thinking about law, much of it can trace back to this, what kind of strictures to impose and why. In the artistic and cultural realms, we celebrate Greek sculpture. Here's a picture of the human form. We celebrate their architectural advances too, of making imposing, graceful, strong buildings. In theater, they developed both both drama, tragedy, comedy that we continue to read and celebrate. In the realms of literature, to say nothing of Greek mythology, they also have developed forms of poetry, epics, history. Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian Wars continues to stand as a model of rational analysis for making sense of a historical event. And then, of course, in the realm of philosophy, ancient Greeks asked questions that humanity has continued to revisit and ask and ponder for over a millennia. So these are some of their great achievements. Here is a picture of the Parthenon, built in the Greek Golden Age, although keep in mind it was built with funds from that were sort of pooled from the Delian League in the name of defense, that were put into developing Athens as a place with public spaces for people to gather. The facade, the original facade on the Parthenon had a facade of citizens acknowledging that this was the people's place. And to this day, the ruins stand and are one of the wonders of the world. I want to just quickly revisit or quickly go through some of the accomplishments of Greek philosophy. Not all of these are in your textbook, but many of them are. So some of the Hellenic and Hellenistic achievements. What's the difference between the word Hellenic and Hellenistic? Well, Hellenic is kind of referring to Greek, and then Hellenistic is broader. When we get into Alexander the Great and that broader world stretching from kind of the Roman Empire to the Persian Empire, but still a world very much influenced and infused by Greek culture and Greek achievements, Hellenistic, kind of the Hellene, although not entirely squarely of the Hellene, the Greek area. So that's kind of the difference between those words, kind of Hellenic, more squarely Greek, although, and Hellenistic, a bit of a broader definition. So in the mid-5th century, there was the philosopher Heraclitus, who, thinking about how the world was formed, gave us this famous observation that you never step in the same river twice, an acknowledgement that change is a single constant in the world we know. As insightful as that observation was, some thinkers of the time, such as Pythagoras of Samos over there on the Ionian Peninsula, and as I mentioned before and will repeat, so much of the richest, earliest Greek philosophy comes from this Ionian Peninsula. Miletus, Samos, not Ionian Peninsula, this region that was called Ionia, that is in the western edge of Anatolia, which is now Turkey, sort of across the Aegean Sea from Greece, where Greeks had settled some colonies, are exposed to different cultural waves, and still have connections to Greece. Pythagoras, at any rate, disturbed by the kind of sense of perhaps chaos at the implicit in this notion of constant change and a lack of permanency, sought permanency and order and things that were unchanging in the human experience. He did this very much through mathematics, and is famously credited with bringing up the Pythagorean theorem, that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, kind of the sum of the area of the square formed with the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the area of the other legs of a triangle, from your geometry class. So, and this was an expression in mathematical form of something that didn't change, something permanent, a stasis in this world of chaos. 2 plus 2 equals 4, always. He was also very interested in music. Hippocrates of Kos was a person that devoted himself to healing, and from him came the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. And it was an approach to helping heal people that was based very much on pragmatism. One of his central principles was, in attempting to heal someone, first do no harm. And that is a principle that to this day is maintained in medical practice. Another great achievement we would, being the historian, he gets bold here instead of underlined to set him apart, revealing my bias of history. Not that he's really my favorite, just he's a historian. Thucydides was a historian, as I said, who wrote this history of the Peloponnesian Wars, and he he looked at this event and he explained it, and that is what historians do. They explain change over time. They explain episodes. And what was new about Thucydides and his historical explanation is that he interpreted this event by going back over the facts, collecting all the information he could, interviewing people that had been a part of it and participated, reading documents, and trying to put together a story. And the story that he put together credited his reasons all derived from human rationales, human foibles. He very much criticizes, he sees this war as the result of hubris and bad judgment. But nonetheless, it's significant that he locates the reasons for this in human reasons, not that the gods wanted it or the gods were having something out, having some bout that humans got caught up in the tide in, as so much mythology tends to, where the explanatory power in so much mythology lies, or that it was simply fated, as the oracles would tell us, or that augurs read it in the entrails of a slaughtered beast, or how a sparrow flew, but that he located the reasons in human actions, human thoughts, however imperfect and flawed those thoughts and actions were. It was nonetheless a rational approach to explaining history. There are also some other really bright stars. Aristarchus of Samos in the 3rd century, he proposed heliocentric theory. Helio, the sun, was at the center of the universe. This is an idea that is not going to catch on until the very end of our course with Copernicus and the scientific revolution of the early modern period. And then I think a real knocking it out of the ballpark achievement of an early Greek philosopher, it was that of Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who calculated the Earth's circumference, and he arrived at a number that is about 25,000 miles in circumference. The actual circumference of the Earth is 24,901 miles. So how he got this close, even though it's been explained to me that he looked at the angles of the sun of different days and triangulated off the lengths of shadows of tall objects to arrive at this calculation, to kind of figure out a bend in the Earth. And by the way, he understood, of course, that the Earth was round, as so many educated people did for millennia already. Nonetheless, it is a phenomenal achievement in my eyes, so, and the eyes of many. So these are just to kind of highlight some, and we could easily have come up with an entirely different list here of the accomplishments of early Greek achievement. And I'll even point out that some of these places, if you look at them on your map, they're not only on the Greek peninsula, although we do start to see Athens as with the academy that Plato founded in the 300s, and then later the Lyceum that his pupil Aristotle founded. Athens was very much the cultural center, but it was not the only show in town. And from the Ionian Peninsula over to some Italian action, there was a rich philosophical tradition throughout the Greek world. And I also want to point out, as if something implicit in this list as well, the ancient world was not at all siloed in fields and subfields and disciplines of inquiry in the way that the academy, the university system, is now organized. Whether you were asking questions about how the world works, which we now might put in science, or how people should live, which we now would put in the category of philosophy or ethics, or maybe religion, and what metaphysical powers exist. That's a question we now delegate to the realm of religion in large part, or how the human body works, which now the natural sciences have even divided to a great degree along botany and zoology and human anatomy and biology, etc. In the Greek academy and among Greek thinkers, it was all just philosophy, the love of learning, and people that were asking questions along all sorts of lines. With that, let me say just a few words about the giants of Greek philosophy. And those giants that I'm thinking of are three: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, your book talks about him and says that he was probably a very annoying person. Socrates lived in Athens in a very troubled time, and he was interested in knowing things and had a skeptical approach. And his approach for reaching understanding was through asking questions, and he would ask questions endlessly. Every answer produced a new question, and he refrained himself from suggesting answers. He just asked questions, and this characteristic made him contributed to him getting this reputation for being such a gadfly, or as your textbook puts it, really annoying. He ultimately, he lost patience with him, and he ultimately sacrifices himself. He is executed by drinking poison in Athens. Here is a picture of him, even kind of heroically, defiantly asking one last question before he drinks his cup of poison. One of Socrates' most famous pupils was Plato, quite disheartened by his teacher's end, no doubt, and it may have contributed to some of his thinking. Here is a picture from the Renaissance of Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle is Plato's pupil. So what we have here is these are not the only members at all, but we have this genealogy from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. And Socrates wrote nothing down, but Plato wrote down much about his teacher. And that's one of the biggest ways that we know, we have some sense of what his thinking entailed. Plato and Aristotle. So both of these individuals think not exclusively, but quite a bit about how to organize society, or that is government, how to have a government. We talked in the last time about the polis, the city-state. There's about 1,000 at one point that probably stretch across Greece, and they're organized along in different ways. And at some points in time, the same polis might be organized differently as well. Athens is most famous for being a democracy. It also had oligarchic time before it was a democracy, and as that democracy was falling apart, essentially. So we've talked a little bit about oligarchy, ruled by a small group; tyranny, ruled by one absolute ruler; democracy, ruled by the many, ruled by the people. There's other types of ocracies as well. Timocracy, ruled by property owners only. The United States of America, when it was first founded, that was very much a principle. Only property owners could vote. A more intensified version of that is ruled by only the wealthy. Only the people that have a real lot of money. The people that have a lot of money, they're the ones that get to make the rules and have a say in the world. We live in a country right now where that is a very contentious idea. Aristocracy, comes from a Greek word deriving from the best people. Aristocracy, ruled by the best people in its original definition, as this played out in the early modern period and before kind of the autocracies of the world were overthrown, that aristocracy came to mean nobility. So it morphed into a social hierarchy as opposed to kind of a specific meaning relating to the quality of an individual. Although depending on which novels you're reading, you might encounter a different take on what I just said. But originally that aristocracy comes from this rule by the best people. And in converse, there was this rule kakistocracy, which was in many ways obsolete until the recent years. It's been resurrected in our own political context to mean rule by the worst people. Kakistocracy, kakistocracy, rule by the worst people. So who was Plato? Plato lived in, was probably born 424 to 423, died until around the middle of the 4th century. And he was from an aristocratic, wealthy family. He was a big man, a tremendous athlete. Supposedly he was a wrestler in his youth. And we remember him now because of the timeless philosophical questions that he asked and of the contributions that he made. And as your textbook describes Plato as something of a romantic type thinker, he had this notion of idealism, that there exists for everything a form that is ideal and perfect, and that reality is a less perfect manifestation of that. So there is this ideal of horse that in an abstract term exists. But any horse that you or I might encounter or touch or see that might live in this earth that we know, this reality, can only approach that ideal. So when he thought about the world and humanity and the thoughts we have and the things we can connect to, he saw that this kind of ideal world that was different from reality. And it's hard to say more that elucidates the matter in short form, as I'm trying to do here. So I'll leave it there. But he was when we think about Plato and his Platonic realism, it's very much based in this unknowable, abstract, ideal place, sphere, that is related to, but not exactly and never found in our real physical world. Plato thought a lot about political philosophy too, and one of his biggest tracts is a series of dialogues written around the 370s, Plato's Republic. And I just want to point out to you that Plato, this citizen from Athens, was no fan of democracy. And in his Republic, he draws his ideal polity, his ideal world. There's a lot to say about this, but I'll just say that in his ideal polity, it was not democratic. That rule was instituted, the polity was ruled by philosopher kings. These philosopher kings that were educated, they had the power to make laws, and they lived somewhat separate from the rest of the polity. And one of the most important components of that separateness was that these people had no property. They did not have money, they did not have property, because Plato was convinced that money corrupts, and that if someone has his or her own personal interests to consider, they cannot consider the interest of the greater good and make the best decisions for the polity at large. So he was not democratic, but he was deeply convinced that the people that make the rules, thinking of the good of the many, cannot be linked to the dynamics of property and wealth gaining. Because if they are, their ability to make the decision for the best, for the greater good, is compromised by their own self-interest. So that's just one feature of the Republic. Now, All of these philosophers, we remember them today because in many ways they asked timeless questions. At the same time, they lived in a particular time. And Plato, for example, lives in, he lives through the demise of Athenian democracy. He lives through the demise of the golden age of democratic Athens. He is born while the Peloponnesian Wars are still going on. He is a, 19 or 20, as Athenian democracy devolves into the rule of 30 tyrants, either imposed by, as Athens is losing this war against Sparta, an oligarchy of 30 tyrants, a little, again, not individual rule oligarchy, but they called them the 30 tyrants, and they're pro-Spartan. So this is a really dark moment in Athenian history, and he lives through it. He also is born in the wake of a typhus epidemic that killed a third of the population, including the ruler Pericles. And of course, the execution of his own teacher for the charge of corrupting the Athenian youth was a big blow to this man. So I think that it's worth recognizing always that Plato lived through the demise of Athenian democracy. Plato's most famous student, who didn't agree with him in many things and has added to the richness of the philosophical tradition, was Aristotle. And Aristotle, as I pointed out, he's not siloed by any particular discipline. He's asking questions in all sorts of areas, and his legacy very much speaks to that. He was most interested, as the earliest lovers of wisdom, the earliest philosophers were interested in, was what is the nature of the world? How does nature work? And what's really significant about Aristotle is that, unlike Plato, who sought to understand the essence of things through this thought exercise of grappling with an abstract ideal that we couldn't actually see, Aristotle believed in observing the world, reaching understanding through observation. We are a long way from the scientific method, but this is one of the kernel precepts of gaining knowledge according to the scientific method, is that we observe the world. So he gets a lot of credit in kind of that protean approach to understanding things that we think of when we think of natural science. Even more than understanding the physical world and its characteristics, to Aristotle, though, was what we would count as truly philosophical questions. To answer that question, what is the most important thing in life? How should we live? Aristotle thought that the most important thing in life was to live a virtuous life, to strive for virtue. How does one achieve virtue? He thought one achieves virtue through the golden mean. And this kind of resonates a bit with various philosophies of the time, Epicureanism and Stoicism. Aristotle's sense of the golden mean was that virtue lies at the right spot between extremes. In many ways, when we think of the Greeks, we very much think of that nothing in excess, that moderation is the way to go. And so Aristotle thought that if at one extreme you have tremendous confidence, and at the other extreme you have total fear, that kind of courage isn't being unafraid, it's acting even when you, as you see is best, even when you're afraid. And so courage was that golden mean for him. If we have self-indulgence at one end of the spectrum and insensitivity to even one's own needs at the other, he thought self-control, that restrained living is the golden mean. Between extravagance and stinginess, there's a place of generosity. Between being vainglorious and maybe entirely small-minded in the way he thought about it, there's a place of honor, having kind of the right amount of pride, but not too much. Between getting really angry about things or not caring less, he thought there was the golden mean was gentleness. And then between the one extreme of being entirely boastful about yourself or being self-deprecating to where you devalue yourself, the golden mean was striking a note of truthfulness. So those are some of the ways in which Aristotle formulated this golden mean. If you're like me, you may look at that and think, I don't think vanity of small-mindedness is the opposite of vanity, and some of this gets lost in translation, but I invite you to read and explore more about Aristotle's golden mean. Now, another thing that he thought a lot about, as I said, was politics. Politics and how to organize society. You're reading an excerpt of his Politics and writing about that. In sum, I would say that Aristotle, he generated questions, but not just at the level of Socrates, of asking a question. Aristotle pursued ways of approaching questions through observation, through determining what's the happy middle between extremes. So I think that if Socrates just asked questions, what Aristotle did more than answering questions, more than providing answers and answers that are right, particularly with the natural world, he made lots of propositions that we have since understood were incorrect. And nonetheless, we give him tremendous credit for generating not only questions, but ways of approaching those questions. Also kind of bringing us back to the historical moment out of the kind of realm of philosophy back into history, he was tutor to Alexander the Great, the huge conqueror that we'll talk more about next time. Before we end, I want to spend just a few minutes in talking about putting on our radar screen some of the paradoxes of Greek civilization. Truly, when we think about the legacies of the Western heritage, those bequeathed by Greek civilization, rank high. Considering the centuries that divide us in the 21st century from classical Greece, and the technologies that they had at their disposal versus the technologies we have at ours, the achievements of the civilization are remarkable. The Greek contributions to civilization are, of course, and well-deservedly, widely lauded. The Renaissance, which we'll study later in our course in Unit 3, the Renaissance was marked in large measure by an appreciation and revival of things, knowledge, and priorities, perhaps, from the ancient world, the Greek world. So for all those things we celebrate, however, there are paradoxes that we should grapple with. We celebrate the Greeks for beginning to introduce rational thought in opposition to superstition. Above the oracle at Delphi was inscribed the word, know thyself, and nothing in excess. That relates more back to Aristotle's golden mean. Greek politics involved group decisions, this idea that if people put their heads together, we can come up with the best decision. And yet, for all this kind of advancement of rational thought, this was very much a society that still looked to oracles had Vestal versions and occasional, if rare, sacrifice, and resorted regularly to superstition. So we don't want to overplay the presence of rational thought in this society, that rational thought and superstition very much existed. Probably even a bigger issue to kind of just really make sure that we're aware of is we celebrate Greek society for its honoring of freedom and its prioritizing of liberty for citizens. And while that's true, how great to be a citizen in Athens in its golden age. It is important to recognize that the citizen franchise was largely curtailed. We don't have the exact number, and this slide puts up a bunch of them for you. But it may be that 5 or 10% of the population, that's what Thucydides wrote, of the Athenian population were actually citizens. That means did actually participate in government, were subject to the same law. It was a slave society. So much of this thought, so many of these cultural and architectural achievements are built on slave labor. Women did not enjoy the same rights as citizens. Immigrants did not enjoy the same rights as citizens. Medics were foreigners that lived in Greece, and they were often merchants. And while one of Solon's previous reforms was to invite foreigners that immigrated with their entire family. They had to kind of go full in, live in Greece, and they were invited to become citizens. But foreigners that came and went and traveled as merchants, they were not citizens. They did not have the rights of citizens. In large part, they were looked down upon. For example, Aristotle, among his many ideas, was very dismissive of merchants. There was in classical Greek society this notion that to engage oneself in the pursuit of money is a bad and tainted endeavor. There's a little bit of a catch-22 here. It is wonderful to be rich, but it is bad to try actively to become rich. So that one, interestingly enough, doesn't seem to have been sufficiently grappled with. That's my own editorializing. But commerce, the engagement in trade, is very much looked down upon. And in Aristotle's view, a merchant is among the lowliest of people, because whereas a craftsman puts his labor and his knowledge into creating something that might then be sold, and that's legit, and you get a little bit of profit for that. A merchant doesn't create anything. A merchant just kind of acquires some sort of product, moves it, sells it, and in that gap between moving and selling, accrues some profit. And so, according to Aristotle, nothing really of value was produced, and that's why this was a lowly form, not a virtuous form of living at all. And then finally, I'd just like to say a few words about women. That Odysseus in the Iliad wrote that happy is the home where men and women live in agreement, which may suggest a bit of respect for the woman, but it was very much a place where the woman's place was in the home. Not only that, in a particular part of the home, the gynaeceum, women did not, in democratic Athens, women very rarely went out into public life. And this is the place where so much of society is in public places. We'll talk about in the Hellenistic period, later in the medieval period, we see the development of private spaces, private homes, even luxurious, at some point, estates maybe. Greece was a society where homes were, even among the wealthy, were maybe modest functional endeavors, and people gave their money for the cultivation of public spaces, theaters, forums, gymnasiums. It was part of a culture. And so much of life took place in public spaces where citizens came together to discuss ideas of the day, solutions, problems, etc., democracy in action. But women were not a part of that picture. They weren't a part of that endeavor. They were confined in large part to the home. And there's other available evidence that suggests that for Odysseus's nice remark about happy is a home where the men and women live in agreement, other evidence suggests that the husband customarily had little emotional attachment to their wives. There's some ancient Greek texts that Herodotus criticized one Lydian king, Candalus, and he said that Candalus fell in love with his own wife, a fancy that had strange consequences, suggesting to us that it wasn't the norm for a husband to love his wife. Not that there wasn't love, but to have it be directed towards your wife was a little weird. Another Athenian orator wrote, says, out in public, prostitutes we have for pleasure, concubines for daily physical attendance, wives to bear us legitimate children, and be our faithful housekeepers. That's one comment that diminishes perhaps the role of wives and really slots women into these particular and sort of service towards men oriented functions. Men, however, experienced love in relationships that had a sort of mentoring and physical component between older men and younger men that were wealthy enough to have those sort of relationships known as pedestry. Foucault wrote, we can't call this homosexuality yet because it wasn't a permanent condition in a stage of life, but we know that male-to-male sexual relations were a normal part of Greek citizen life. But back to this role of women, I would just point out that in Greek society, the punishment was more serious for a consensual affair than for a violent rape. There's a case of Euphiletus where we see this acted out, and the principle that underlies it is that it is deeply dangerous to a husband's honor if a wife would make a choice to engage in a sexual act that could produce an illegitimate heir or damage that man's honor, and therefore must be seriously policed and punished. Whereas violent rape, from that perspective, not desirable, but wasn't as damaging to a husband's honor because there's no secret betrayal in it. And that is, and so I think that is kind of one aspect of Greek society that we want to keep in mind as we celebrate this society for its democratic principles and for its celebration and practice of freedom in certain ways, to recognize the substantial limits on those ideals of equality. Thanks. That's all for today.